A hard-working maid is humiliated by wedding guests who don't know her true identity. But when she returns as the bride, everything changes. Watch what happens when the tables turn, and the people who once disrespected her are forced to face the truth. Subscribe now to see the shocking transformation. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a wedding reception filled with laughter, music, and happy memories. But for Tanya Williams, it was anything but that. Tanya had been working at the Grandview Hotel for months, doing her job as a maid with quiet professionalism. She had seen all kinds of events come and go, but this one felt different. Tonight, she was cleaning up after one of the most extravagant weddings the hotel had ever hosted, and everything seemed perfect, except for the way she was treated by some of the guests. As she moved through the ballroom, dusting tables and picking up discarded napkins, she overheard the laughter of a group of guests at one of the long tables. They looked down at her with sneers, making snide comments as she walked by. "I bet she's just dreaming of a life like ours," one of the women said, loud enough for Tanya to hear. Tanya kept her head down, pretending not to notice, but inside, her heart sank. She had worked hard to get to this point. She had dreams, goals, and a future that wasn't tied to cleaning up after people. Yet here she was, invisible to those who thought they were better than her, simply because of the uniform she wore. As the night went on, things got worse. One of the male guests, clearly drunk, stood up from his seat and stumbled over to Tanya. "Hey, sweetheart," he slurred, his eyes gleaming with a mix of arrogance and alcohol. "Why don't you come clean my table, huh? You missed a spot." The other guests laughed, and Tanya felt the weight of their judgment in that one moment. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to snap back, but she had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response in situations like this. She wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who had worked hard to get where she was, no matter how small her role seemed to others. But what they didn't know, what they would never guess, was that Tanya had been working toward something far bigger than this. Something that would turn the tables in a way they couldn't even imagine. Tanya wasn't going to let these moments of humiliation define her. She would rise, and when she did, they would regret ever looking down on her. The night went on, and Tanya finished her work, exhausted but determined. She cleaned up the mess, tried to ignore the stares, and left the ballroom just as the last of the guests were heading out. As the hotel doors closed behind her, she knew that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Tomorrow, she would take one more step toward the life she had dreamed of. But what she didn't know was that fate had something far more dramatic in store for her. Days passed, and Tanya's life remained the same, working long hours, keeping her head down, always underappreciated, until one day she received an invitation. It wasn't just any invitation. It was from the same hotel that had humiliated her weeks ago, inviting her back for an event. Tanya couldn't believe it. But this time, things were going to be different. Tanya was no longer the maid. She had worked, fought, and sacrificed to make her dreams a reality. She had come a long way from the woman they had once looked down on. This time, she was walking through those same hotel doors, not as a worker, but as the bride. The very people who had mocked her would soon see the new Tanya, confident, successful, and powerful, and they would have no choice but to face the consequences of their cruelty. Tanya was about to show them just how wrong they were. The wedding wasn't just her celebration, it was her revenge. The day she had been waiting for had arrived. The day of the wedding arrived, and Tanya stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the final touches of her dress. Her heart raced, but it wasn't out of nervousness. It was excitement, the kind of excitement you feel when you know something big is about to happen, something that will change everything. She had chosen a sleek, elegant white gown that hugged her curves perfectly. It was simple, but stunning, a symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she had overcome. Her hair, styled in soft waves, framed her face just right, and her makeup highlighted her natural beauty. Tanya had transformed from the maid in a uniform to a woman who commanded respect. As she looked at her reflection, Tanya thought back to all the moments that had led her to this point. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the hours spent studying, the struggles she had faced, and the strength it took to never give up. But none of that mattered now. Today wasn't about the past. It was about showing the world who she had become. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Tanya walked down the aisle with grace, her gaze steady and full of purpose. The guests, most of whom had no idea who she really was, turned their heads, watching in awe as she moved past them. The same guests who had once looked down on her, who had laughed at her when she was just a maid, now sat in stunned silence, unable to look away. When Tanya reached the altar, she locked eyes with the man she was about to marry, a man who had supported her dreams, who had seen her for who she truly was. He wasn't just a part of her story. He was the one who helped her build her future. As they exchanged vows, Tanya felt the weight of every step she had taken to get to this moment. She wasn't just getting married. She was reclaiming her life, her dignity, and her future. But the real twist came after the ceremony. As Tanya and her new husband walked into the reception hall, the atmosphere shifted. The same people who had once humiliated her were now standing awkwardly, unsure of how to act. The room buzzed with whispers, but this time they weren't laughing at Tanya. They were whispering because they realized something. They had underestimated her. One of the women who had made those cruel comments weeks ago now approached Tanya, her face pale with guilt. "Tanya, I didn't know," she stammered. "I never realized who you really were. I'm so sorry for what I said." Tanya smiled politely, but her eyes were cold. "You didn't know, but now you do," she replied, her voice steady. She wasn't looking for an apology. She didn't need one. What she needed was for them to understand the lesson they'd been taught. Tanya wasn't someone to be underestimated. She wasn't just a maid or someone working in the background. She was a woman who had the power to change her life. And anyone who tried to hold her back would have to face the consequences. The night went on, but the energy had shifted. The same guests who had once looked at Tanya with judgment now saw her for who she truly was, an accomplished woman, confident and strong, living the life she had worked so hard for. They couldn't ignore her now, and Tanya made sure they wouldn't forget her. As the reception drew to a close, Tanya stood by the door, watching the guests leave. She knew that this night would stick with them. They would think twice before ever looking down on someone again. For Tanya, this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about turning the page on a chapter of her life where she was invisible to those who thought they could walk all over her. She was no longer the maid. She was the bride, and as she waved goodbye to the last guest, she felt a sense of peace. She had done it. She had shown them all